Chapter 3. The Intimacy of Strangers. On June 18, 2016, the descent module of a Soyuz spacecraft landed on a bleak steppe in Kazakhstan. 3 people were pulled safely from the scorched capsule following a stint at the International Space Station. The astronauts weren't alone as they plummeted to Earth. Under their seats were hundreds of living organisms packed tightly in a box. Among the samples were several species of lichen that had been sent into space for 1.5 years as part of the Biology and Mars experiment. BioMex is an international consortium of astrobiologists who use trays mounted on the outside of the ISS, a piece of apparatus known as the Expose Facility, to incubate biological specimens in extraterrestrial conditions. "Let's hope they have a safe return," Natushka Lee, one of the BioMex lichen team, remarked to me a few days before the landing was scheduled. I wasn't sure who she meant by they, but soon afterward, Lee got in touch to say that all was well. She had received an email from the lead researcher at the German Aerospace Center in Berlin and read out the subject line, relieved. "Expose trays back on Earth. Soon," Lee smiled, "we will have our samples back." A number of organisms with extreme tolerances have been sent into orbit, from bacterial spores to free-living algae to rock-dwelling fungi to tardigrades, microscopic animals known as water bears. Some can survive if shielded from the damaging effects of solar radiation, but few, apart from a handful of lichen species, are able to survive in full space conditions, drenched in unfiltered cosmic rays. So remarkable are these lichens' ability that they have become model life forms for astrobiological research, ideal organisms to discern, as one researcher writes, the limits and limitations of terrestrial life. It isn't the first time lichens have helped humans to fathom the limits of life as we know it. Lichens are living riddles. Since the 19th century, they have provoked fierce debate about what constitutes an autonomous individual. The closer we get to lichens, the stranger they seem. To this day, lichens confuse our concept of identity and force us to understand where one organism stops and another begins. In his lavishly illustrated book, Art Forms in Nature, 1904, the biologist and artist Ernst Haeckel vividly portrayed a variety of lichen forms. His lichens sprout and layer deliriously. Veined ridges give way to smooth bubbles. Stalks elaborate into prongs and dishes. Rugged coastlines meet unearthly pavilions, their forms lined with nooks and crannies. It was Haeckel who in 1866 had coined the word ecology. Ecology describes the study of the relationships between organisms and their environments, both the places where they live and the thicket of relationships that sustain them. Inspired by the work of Alexander von Humboldt, the study of ecology emerged from the idea that nature is an interconnected whole, a system of active forces. Organisms could not be understood in isolation. 3 years later, in 1869, the Swiss botanist Simon Schwendinger published a paper advancing the dual hypothesis of lichen. In it, he presented the radical notion that lichen were not a single organism, as had long been assumed. Instead, he argued that they were composed of 2 quite different entities, a fungus and an alga. Schwendinger proposed that the lichen fungus, known today as the mycobiont, offered physical protection and acquired nutrients for itself and for the algal cells. The algal partner, known today as the photobiont, a role sometimes played by photosynthetic bacteria, harvested light and carbon dioxide to make sugars that provided energy. In Schwendinger's view, the fungal partners were parasites, although with the wisdom of statesmen. The algal partners were its slaves, which it had sought out and forced into its service. Together they grew into the visible body of lichen. In their relationship, both partners were able to make a life in places where neither could survive alone. Schwendinger's suggestion was vehemently opposed by his fellow lichenologists. The idea that 2 different species could come together in the building of a new organism with its own separate identity was shocking to many. A useful and invigorating parasitism, one contemporary snorted. Who ever before has heard such a thing? Others dismissed it as a sensational romance, an unnatural union between a captive algal damsel and a tyrant fungal master. Some were more moderate. "You see," wrote the English microbiologist Beatrix Potter, better known for her children's books, "we do not believe in Schwendinger's theory." Most worrisome for taxonomists working hard to order life into neat lines of descent was the prospect that a single organism could contain two separate lineages. Following Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, first published in 1859, species were understood to arise by diverging from one another. Their evolutionary lineages forked like the branches of a tree. The trunk of the tree forked into branches, which forked into smaller branches, which forked into twigs. Species were the leaves on the twigs of the tree of life. However, the dual hypothesis suggested that lichens were bodies composed of organisms with quite different origins. Within lichens, branches of the tree of life had been diverging for hundreds of millions of years, and they were doing something entirely unexpected: converging. Over the following decades, a number of biologists adopted the dual hypothesis, but many disagreed with Schwendinger's portrayal of the relationship. These were not sentimental concerns. Schwendinger's choice of metaphor obstructed the larger questions raised by the dual hypothesis. In 1877, the German botanist Albert Frank coined the word symbiosis to describe the living together of fungal and algal partners. In his study of lichens, it has become clear to him that a new word was required, one that didn't prejudice the relationship it described. Shortly afterwards, the biologist Heinrich Anton de Bary adopted Frank's term and generalized it to refer to a full spectrum of interactions between any type of organism, stretching from parasitic on one pole to mutually beneficial at the other. Scientists made a number of major new symbiotic claims in the years that followed, including startling suggestions from Frank that fungi might help plants to obtain nutrients from the soil. All cited the dual hypothesis of lichen in support of their ideas. When algae were found living inside corals, sponges, and green sea slugs, they were described by one researcher as animal lichens. Several years later, when viruses were first observed within bacteria, their discoverer described them as microlichens. Lichens, in other words, grew quickly into a biological principle. They were a gateway organism to the idea of symbiosis, an idea that ran against the prevailing currents in evolutionary thought in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, best summed up in Thomas Henry Huxley's portrayal of life as a gladiator show, whereby the strongest, the swiftest, and the cunningest live to fight another day. In the wake of the dual hypothesis, evolution could no longer be thought of solely in terms of competition and conflict. Lichen had become a type case of inter-kingdom collaboration. Lichens encrust as much as 8% of the planet's surface, an area larger than that covered by tropical rainforests. They clad rocks, trees, roofs, fences, cliffs, and the surface of deserts. Some are a drab camouflage. Some are lime green or electric yellow. Some look like stains, others look like small shrubs, others like antlers. Some leather and droop like bat wings. Others, as the poet Brenda Hillman writes, are hung in hashtags. Some live on beetles whose lives depend on the camouflage the lichens provide. Untethered lichens, known as vagrants or erratics, blow around and don't live their lives on anything in particular. Against the plain story of their surroundings, observe Carrie Knudsen, the curator of lichens at the Herbarium of the University of California, Riverside, lichens look like fairy tales. I have been most captivated by lichens on the island off the coast of British Columbia, on the west coast of Canada. Seen from above, the coastline frays into the ocean. There is no hard edge. The land comes undone gradually into inlets and sounds, and then into channels and passages. Hundreds of islands scatter off the coast. Some are no bigger than a whale. The largest, Vancouver Island, is half the length of Britain. Most of the islands are solid granite rock, the tops of submarine hills and valleys worn smooth by glaciers. For a few days every year, I and a handful of friends pile onto a 28-foot sailboat and set off around the islands. The boat, the Caper, has a dark green hull, no keel, and one red sail. Making our way from the Caper onto land is tricky. We paddle in an unstable dinghy with oars that slip their rowlocks at every stroke. Pulling up to the shore is an art form. Waves shrug the dinghy onto the rocks and tug it away from our feet as we clamber out. But once on shore, the lichens begin. I've spent hours observed in the worlds that they make, islands of life in a sea of rock. The names used to describe lichens sound like afflictions, words that get stuck in your teeth. Crustose, crusty, foliose, leafy, squamulose, scaly, leprose, dusty, fruticose, branched. Fruticose lichen drape and tuft. Crustose and squamulose lichens creep and seep. Foliose lichens layer and flake. Some prefer to live on east-facing surfaces, some on the west. Some choose to live on exposed ledges, other in damp groves. Some wage slow wars, repelling or disrupting their neighbors. Some inhabit the surfaces left exposed when other lichen have died and flaked off. They come to resemble the archipelagos and continents of an unfamiliar atlas, which is how Rhizocapron geographicum, or the map lichen, got its name. The oldest surfaces are pitted by centuries of lichenous life and death. Lichen's fondness for rock has changed the face of the planet and continues to do so, sometimes literally. In 2006, the faces of the presidents carved into Mount Rushmore were pressure hosed, removing more than 60 years of lichenous growth in the hope of extending the lifetime of the memorial. The presidents aren't alone. Every monument, writes the poet Drew Milne, has a lichen lining. In 2019, the residents of Easter Island launched a campaign to scrub lichen off hundreds of monumental stone heads, or moai. Described by locals as leprosy, lichens are deforming the features of the statues and softening the rock to a clay-like consistency. Lichens mine minerals from rock in a twofold process known as weathering. First, they physically break up surfaces by the force of their growth. Second, they deploy an arsenal of powerful acids and mineral-binding compounds to dissolve and digest the rock. Lichen's ability to weather makes them a geological force, yet they do more than dissolve the physical features of the world. When lichens die and decompose, they give rise to the first soils in new ecosystems. Lichens are how the inanimate mineral mass within rocks is able to cross over into the metabolic cycles of the living. A portion of the minerals in your body is likely to have passed through a lichen at some point. Whether on tombstones in a graveyard or encased within slabs of Antarctic granite, lichens are go-betweens that inhabit the boundary dividing life and non-life. Looking out from the caper at the rocky Canadian coastline, this becomes clear. Above the tide line, there is only, after several meters of lichen and moss, larger trees that start to appear, rooted in crevices well beyond the water's reach where young soils have been able to form. The question of what is and isn't an island is fundamental to the study of ecology and evolution. It is no less important for astrobiologists, including those on the Biomex team, many of whom wrestle with the question of panspermia, from the Greek pan meaning all and sperma meaning seed. Panspermia deals with the question of whether plants, too, are islands, and whether life can travel through space between celestial bodies. It is an idea that has circulated since antiquity, although it didn't take on the form of a scientific hypothesis until the early 20th century. Some advocates argue that life itself arrived from other planets. Some propose instead that life evolved on Earth and elsewhere, and periods of dramatic evolutionary novelty on Earth were triggered by the arrival of fragments of life from space. Others argue instead for a soft panspermia, where life itself evolved on Earth, but the chemical building blocks required for life arrived from space. There are many hypotheses as to how interplanetary transport might take place. Most are variations on a theme. Organisms get trapped within asteroids or other debris ejected from planets during collisions with meteorites and hurtle through space before colliding with another planetary body on which they may or may not be able to make a life. In the late 1950s, as the United States prepared to send rockets into space, the biologist Joshua Lederberg became concerned about the prospect of celestial contamination. It was Lederberg who in 2001 coined the word microbiome. Humans were now able to spread earthly organisms to other parts of the solar system. More worrying was the thought that humans could bring back to Earth alien organisms that could cause ecological disruption, or worse, wreak havoc and disease. Liederberg wrote urgent letters to the National Academy of Sciences to warn them of the possible cosmic catastrophe. They paid attention and released an official statement of concern. There was still no word to describe the science of extraterrestrial life, so Liederberg coined one: exobiology. It was the first version of the field now known as astrobiology. Liederberg was a prodigy. He enrolled at Columbia University at the age of 15 and in his early 20s made a discovery that helped transform our understanding of the history of life. He found that a bacteria could trade genes with each other. One bacterium could acquire a trait from another bacterium horizontally. Characteristics acquired horizontally are those that aren't inherited vertically from one's parents. One picks them up along the way. We're used to the principle. When we learn or teach something, we're part of a horizontal exchange of information. Much of human culture and behavior is transmitted in this fashion. However, for humans to engage in horizontal gene transfer of bacteria, as bacteria do, is a fascinating prospect, even though it has taken place on occasion deep in our evolutionary history. Horizontal gene transfer means that genes and the traits they encode are infectious. It is as if we noticed an unmarked trait lying by the side of the road, tried it on, and found that we had acquired a pair of dimples. Or perhaps we met someone on the street and swapped our straight hair for their curly hair. Or maybe we just picked up their eye color, or brushed up against a wolfhound quite by accident and developed an urge to run fast for several hours a day. Liederberg's discovery won him a Nobel Prize at the age of 33. Before horizontal gene transfer was discovered, bacteria, like all other organisms, were understood to be biological islands. Genomes were closed systems. There was no way to take on new DNA midway through a lifetime, to acquire genes that had evolved off-site. Horizontal gene transfer changes this picture and shows bacterial genomes to be cosmopolitan places, made up of genes that have evolved separately for millions of years. Horizontal gene transfer implied, as lichens had before, that branches of the evolutionary tree that has long since diverged were able to converge within the body of a single organism. For bacteria, horizontal gene transfer is the norm. Most of the genes in any given bacterium do not share an evolutionary history, but are acquired piecemeal, just as objects accumulate in a home. In this way, a bacterium can acquire characteristics ready-made, speeding up evolution many times over. By exchanging DNA, an harmless bacterium can acquire antibiotic resistance and metamorphose into a virulent superbug in a single move. Over the last few decades, it has become clear that bacteria aren't alone in this ability, although they remain its most adept practitioners. Genetic material has been exchanged horizontally between all the domains of life. Liederberg's ideas were tinged with Cold War paranoia. In his hands, panspermia came to resemble horizontal gene transfer on a cosmic scale. For the first time in history, humans were capable, in theory, of infecting Earth and other planets with organisms that had not evolved on site. Life on Earth could no longer be considered a genetically closed system, a planetary island in an uncrossable sea. Just as bacteria could fast-forward evolution by picking up DNA horizontally, so the arrival of foreign DNA on Earth could short-circuit the otherwise torturous process of evolution with potentially catastrophic consequences.